First, I would ask them, why? Why do you think you want an old home, right? They're probably going to say a few things. They're probably going to say, I think they're made better. I'm probably going to tend to agree with them. They're probably going to say, I like the way that it looks. I want something charming. I want something with personality, right? Great. Are you adverse to replacing pipes? Are you adverse to rewiring a home? Are you adverse to, there's going to be things that when you see an inspection report, the code changes all the time. Are you okay with, the inspection report looks really crazy, but just know that like electric code, for example, changes like every year. It changes all the time. If there's, tube electrical, that's probably going to be pretty scary. Versus we see aluminum, and as long as it's completely functioning, that's probably not something we're going to negotiate. And you have to be a savvy buyer in that way, because just because it's old and you don't think you want that doesn't mean that you get to negotiate that out. Now, if there's a problem with that, then it doesn't make sense in most cases to go in and put in more aluminum wiring. And sometimes that can actually be a really great situation to get into as a buyer, because if it's messed up enough, we might be able to negotiate. If it's going to be something that another buyer is going to come in, they're going to have the same issue, the seller probably does have to actually deal with that. So it can actually be positive to come in on an old home as a buyer and there be something seriously wrong if it's not everything, because that's what gives us the power to really get you in good shape. Yeah, when it comes to East Side bungalows, if we're talking about old homes, you just want to be mindful that there wasn't as much money on the East Side, generationally speaking. And so you really do need to hire a real estate agent who knows about old homes. When you're interviewing an agent, make sure that they've sold old homes. Make sure that they've sold old homes on the East Side, because while your agent is not going to be able to tell you the home is great or it's bad, if they know that, there are certain things that for me with my clients, we can walk in, we can tour, and I can tell them right off the bat, I can say, this is going to be a money pit. I can see too many things that I can tell are really, really wrong, or at least give them the heads up on, right? Like if we go in and they're looking around, they're trying to figure out, do they like the home? Oh, I love this. It's so cute. I'm looking under the sink and seeing like, are we looking at galvanized pipes? Do we have cast iron pipes? I'm running the faucet and seeing, does that water come out clear or does it come out rusty? Is it sputtering out, right? These are ways that I can tell that there may or may not be an issue in the pipes. These are ways that I can tell that there may or may not be a break in the pipes. You of course want to get a home inspection, but I'm not relying as an agent on just the inspection. There are things that I can at least make us aware of, and it does not mean we shouldn't place an offer. It means that we know that we're definitely dealing with galvanized pipes. If they're working fine, we probably are just going to have to know that at any given point, you might have to replace those, right? Comes with the territory. If you are just trying to find an old home that's had the pipes replaced, for example, you might really be dwindling yourself down a list. Also, you're probably going to pay more for that, right? I had a client who I put on the water and it was sputtering out. It was clear that there was some sort of issue in the pipe system. My client still wanted to contract. And I told my client, I said, we cannot crawl inside of a seller's brain and possibly know where their head's at, what their need to sell is, right? But what I can say in pretty good faith is that any buyer is going to come in here and want the water to work. And so I actually would rather see these old pipes and see this issue, because I feel a lot more confident that I can negotiate a full pipe PVC replacement for you. So I actually love that we're seeing this issue. Yeah, so if you are planning your finances out and you want to buy an older home, there's a little bit of difference, right? So if depending on your type of loan, If you're conventional, they're gonna be a little bit more loose with the margins for approval than, let's say, an FHA. If I have an FHA buyer and they're looking to buy an old home, we need to be very mindful when we're looking at the home. And I'm gonna have conversations up front with the seller, with the listing agent, because let's say, for example, I can tell that the roof is really messed up and we're on an FHA loan. I know that we could get into contract and the deal can completely fall apart, because if we can't come to an agreement on the roof, the FHA loan, they're not going to approve the loan. And so now we effectively wasted everyone's time. If you're knowledgeable about that and you know what to look for, you can ahead of time have that conversation, and maybe they say like, yeah, no, we're not willing to do that, right? It's still going to be hearsay. It's still going to be good faith, right? But in my mind, if a seller is willing to get into contract and we've had the conversation that, look, if FHA won't approve, it looks like there's something going to be wrong with the roof. Are you willing to repair that if it comes down to that? If they say yes, right? I think there's a pretty slim chance that they're not going to do that, even though it's good faith once we're in contract, because it doesn't behoove them to break contract, have to go and find another buyer, that sort of thing. Same with windows. If I see a broken window, again, especially with FHA, that's going to make it to where they won't finance that. I'm going to have that conversation ahead of time, but that's also why when we're walking the home and my client can just be looking at the space and the aesthetics and the floor plan and the things they might want to change, I really need to be looking at potential issues so that we can get ahead of them. Because I do think that is why you hire an agent, is to also save your time and your peace of mind. There's a lot of situations where we can get ahead of things without ever going in contract. We don't want to just rely on the home inspection. It is important to know about financing. It is important to know about the things that will kill a deal and get ahead of that as much as you possibly can. Yeah, in terms of lifestyle, someone might choose an older home, a charming, quirky craftsman or bungalow or Victorian home over something that is sleek and modern, or just new. And you know that there's, you know what you're getting. New homes have problems too, but you can mitigate your risks. I very much believe that you should decorate according to your home. One of the things that I absolutely hate to see is whenever someone has a style home on the outside and the interior design just does not talk to it. I do think that in some ways it should be cohesive. If you really like bespoke wooden antique furniture, you probably don't want to get a hyper modern home, right? It's probably not going to look great in there. On the flip side, if you like more of like an industrial minimalist vibe, that might not look great in a bungalow from the 1900s, right? There is like a little bit of a hybrid there where you have some of these mid-century modern homes, and they do work with a little bit more of like a sleek line, more like modern look. But I think that that's a lot of it. I also think that there are people who, feel like, and I would agree with them, those homes were built better, and also believe in preservation versus tear down and the integrity of an existing location and neighborhood, and keeping and really putting life back into, or even if someone else has done that, moving in with intention to the neighborhood in the way that it was originally built, right? It really just comes down to buyer preference. I don't think there's a right or a wrong. There's a lot of reasons why someone would want something old. I do think right now it is a trend. So you are going to run into people who are trend buyers. And I always want to talk about that, because you don't want to necessarily buy a home with that mindset, because it's such a long-term purchase that if you are just buying it for a trend and you're not willing to put in the sweat equity that sometimes an older home is going to require, then you might actually end up regretting your purchase. I have worked with so many people to buy old homes. One of the reasons for that is very much a word of mouth. Again, It's not something if you don't have experience with as an agent. I remember the first time that I did go to help a client with an old home, I was extremely intimidated. And I made sure that I got help and support because it's very easy to jump the gun and panic and think that things are problems that aren't. The client needs an agent to guide them, not to panic along with them, right? And there's no such thing as a perfect home. So the reason I worked with a lot of people with older homes is because the word gets out there. People do love to tell people they have a plug, right? So if you have someone, they're looking for an old home, I helped their friend buy an old home, they're gonna all day tell their friend about that. I had a recent client where we went into the house, and this gets harder and harder, by the way, the lower that the budget gets. When you have a lot of money to play with and you're buying an old home, it's a lot easier, especially based on the location that you're going for, to get something that feels newer, right? It's been gutted, it's been completely remodeled. A lot of them aren't like that. And so I've done quite a few that are sub 500, sub 550 on the east side in, areas that are 10 minutes to get to all the bars, things like that, 10 minutes to get to a great restaurant. That gets very difficult. You're really getting into borderline tear down pricing there. So we have to go in and we have to be able to look at, is this a tear down? I know that you have this much money. Does it make sense for you to go a little further out? Does it make sense for you to buy something newer? Because I know you want this charming house, but do you really know what you're getting yourself into? I recently had a buyer who we walked in, and I immediately was like, okay, the foundation is really good. Off to a great start. We need to be able to balance out the things that are going to be a problem and the things that are in place and good, because it is a trade-off. So I said, I feel really confident that we have great foundation. It's also, a lot of the old homes are pier and beam homes. So they're not sitting on a concrete slab. And so one of the things you want to look for is there enough clearance underneath the home? If you have a very small crawl space, what that tells you is that the home, it has been sinking, which is not as scary as it sounds. It's something that happens, but ideally you don't want to get into that situation when you're not buying something as a teardown, unless everything else is great, right? So that's the first thing I noticed. I noticed that the roof was new, and I said, okay, we can check another box. I did notice that the pipes were probably going to have a problem. And so my client started kind of freaking out and saying like, oh, you told me about the old pipes. You told me that this was something that we had to look out for. And it seems like they're messed up. The water was barely trickling out in one sink. In another sink, it straight up didn't come out. In another, in the shower, it came out like spattery and kind of brown. And I turned to her and I looked at her and I said, I'm actually really excited to see the pipes like this. And she was like, what do you mean? And I said, if we go to the seller and we say, this is what happened, we can back it up. I said, I'm taking video right now. We're going to back it up on our inspection. I said, there's not going to be another buyer that's going to come in behind us and be fine with the water being that way. And we know that they're old pipes. And so I think we have a very high odds of getting the entire home repiped as part of our negotiation. And that's exactly what we were able to do. I had a similar situation with electric not too long ago. There were so many fire hazards. It was old tube piping, or electric. There were so many problems. There were outlets that did not work. There were outlets that were completely out of code. They were from like the 20s. There were Federal Pacific panels, which are pretty common on houses that are 1970s and prior, but they've been recalled. They were known to explode and catch on fire. They're a huge fire hazard. And the combination of all of these things, we were able to get the house rewired. You couldn't necessarily do that if you just said, oh, the wiring or the electric is pretty old. That's part of it. If you go in and there's some minor issues, you're not going to negotiate a rewiring of the home. So sometimes, depending on the seller, depending on the situation, it's really good to have something that is a bigger issue. As long as you see some positives in other areas, it's kind of great.